Hello, I am Veronica and a counselling psychologist working with children from domestic violence situations. Having just explored domestic violence from the perspective of the victim and perpetrator with Greta and Madeline, I'm going to bring your attention to the young witnesses of domestic violence. After it had been recognised as a crime in the 1980s, it became apparent that refuges for women and their children fleeing domestic violence were devastatingly important, and by 2012 at least 30% of homeless people were mothers with their children, of which at least a quarter were also fleeing domestic violence. And from an Indigenous perspective, a large study found that at least 18% of infants and 42% of 10-year-olds would also be exposed. So, due to the prevalence of domestic violence and its exposure on children, it is no surprise that governing bodies and agencies created systems to protect children and to make sure that they received the therapeutic interventions that they required. The cornerstone of counselling children exposed to domestic violence is to first ensure that they are out of harm's way. If children are still in the domestic violence context, i.e. living with the perpetrator whilst receiving therapy, then this can actually increase the risk of violence and emotional and psychological harm. However, once children are safe from the physical and violent elements of the trauma, a focus on their emotional and psychological recovery can begin. Surprisingly though, traditional family therapies have not been found to be incredibly helpful for children, and have even been found to predict similar outcomes as just mentioned, such as increased risk of violence. In parallel, it appears that in addressing domestic violence as a family problem, the counsellor may inadvertently pathologise the child, as the family is treated as a unit and not as victims and perpetrators, although it is not clear if these effects could be mitigated by counsellor attributes. But before we explore some alternative therapies for children, it is important as counsellors to be aware of some of the symptoms children may experience after being exposed to domestic violence. Externalising behaviours such as impulsivity and hyperactivity, which could lead to disorders such as ADHD and oppositional defiance disorder. This might be as a result from overactive and sensitive neurological stress response systems. We go on to internal dysregulation issues such as anxiety and depression. Again, this might be as a result of deeply entrenched fear and shame and low self-esteem. Physiological problems such as headaches and sleep disturbances. And subsequently, exposure to trauma such as domestic violence can lead to long-term damage to the development and neural networks related to sleep, attention, cognition, and affect regulation. So, as a counselling psychologist, I might start approaching some of these issues with an intervention such as play therapy, which is not only an evidence-based approach but is also an innately intuitive approach to working with children, as it is their natural medium for self-expression, communication and learning, and in parallel has been found to be effective at treating all of the aforementioned symptoms a child might experience. For example, a child experiencing domestic violence may have a strong external locus of control, but through sand-tray play, they can project, manipulate, and resolve painful life narratives, and in turn reduce their anxiety as they take control of their story in the fantasy of play. Although play seems the obvious and rational approach to working with children, it is important to consider that effect sizes found on symptoms such as ADHD with traumatized children have been small, and research is often only carried out on small groups or individual case studies. So just something to think about. In parallel with play therapy, art therapy also attends to experiences that are pre-verbal and allows a child's stories to be communicated and understood. Art has the power to recover the photographic nature of traumatic memories so that they can be explored within the safety of the external expression on the paper. As a counselling psychologist, I might invite a child to choose whatever art materials they would like to use to create a story. This child-centered, non-directive and imaginative approach has been found to be most effective, as it takes the pressure off children to intentionally expose the perpetrator and helps alleviate any feelings of betrayal. Through art therapy in counselling children have been found to be able to reduce their anxiety and again develop a sense of control and symbolic power over their situation. However, it is important to remember that using children's drawings as evidence or assessment without verbal confirmation from the artist can be tricky, and research on this area is still very inconclusive. However, when delivering these interventions, another important factor to consider when working with children is the impact that domestic violence will have on the developing brain. Early trauma has been found to significantly alter the development and subsequent structure of a child's brain. Bruce Perry recognized that counselors must companion children in repairing the parts of the brain damaged by trauma that are also currently impacting their current functioning. It is a developmentally and biologically informed approach to working with traumatized children. Depending on how the individual child is functioning, a neurosequential model for therapy will provide children with the necessary intervention to repair the level of brain functioning impaired by traumatic history. This might include sensory integration for lower level functioning, and then art and play therapy to foster higher levels of functioning, such as relational knowledge and insight. In reflection, a counsellor is attempting to offer children the opportunity to develop their own healthy brain, to help them build resilience and strengthen their ability to build positive relationships. It must be noted, though, that research in this area is scarce, and the research used here had very small samples and no control group, so pre- and post-treatment effects could not be scientifically established. But even with the most effective interventions and trauma-informed models, positive outcomes will most notably be down to counsellor attributes. It is fundamental to build a strong and trusting therapeutic relationship. This might take time, as children recovering from domestic violence may have lost the ability to trust, and will need to relearn this fundamental relational quality. This will develop if the therapist provides a safe and autonomous space, is gentle and patient. It is also especially important at the outset of counselling that the counsellor provides non-directive invitations so that the child has time to understand that this is a place where they can control what happens. It is also hard for this population to regulate their emotions, behaviours and engagement, so having a full, creative and flexible toolkit and therapeutic approach is imperative. And finally, having lost so much, it is also extremely important that children learn how to have fun again. Thank you, and now I pass you on to Hannah, who is going to address domestic violence in the community.